All right, thank you for joining us for today's event on understanding routine costs in Medicare clinical trials and IDE submissions. My name's Mary Sue Gardner. I'm a registered nurse on the Provider Outreach and Education team, and I'm going to be your facilitator for today's event. So I'm also joined by my friend and colleague, Jennifer Boniface, who's going to be assisting with the chat portion and the Q&A portion of today's call, as well as representatives from medical review and our policy department who are just there on standby in case I need them for assistance with anything on today's call. A few housekeeping items before we get started. In our training center on WPSGHA.com, you're going to find all things education, such as training materials like the slide deck for today's presentation. You're also going to find any upcoming educational events, and you'll have event access to our encore presentations that you can watch outside of YouTube. So those encore presentations are the actual recording of our live events, and they're usually on our encore page for about 60 to 90 days, but they're always available on our YouTube page until that information is changed or it's updated. If you have any questions during today's event, you can place those questions into the chat and send that to all panelists. Finally, if you have any feedback about your experience today, there's going to be opportunity now and during the event and even at the end of the event to take our survey. Jennifer placed that survey link into the chat, and I just want you to have it in advance if you find that you have to leave the presentation early. We do value your feedback on how we did, the good, the bad, and the ugly. So please let us know how valuable this event was for you. And it's also your opportunity to tell us what additional education you would like us to have to bring to you in the future. All right, on your screen now and in your slide deck, if you're following along, is our disclaimer. And we have to present this disclaimer in all of our education. This disclaimer basically says, what I'm telling you today is as factual as the Medicare laws, rules, and regulations are today. However, know that Medicare rules often change. It's your responsibility as a provider to make sure you're following any laws, rules, and regulations that are in place on the day you are providing services to any Medicare beneficiary. So please refer to the CMS website for all current laws, rules, and regulations. This next slide here is just a list of acronyms. Now, Medicare is full of acronyms, and just about everything under the sun in Medicare contains an acronym. So if I happen to use an acronym today that you are not familiar with, go ahead and refer back to this slide in your slide deck. Or if you don't have the slide deck in front of you, or the acronym, I happen to throw out is not one listed here, you can simply put that in the chat, and Jennifer or one of my other colleagues will help get that answered for you. All right, the objective and agenda for today. So Medicare provides coverage for routine costs of qualifying clinical trials and investigational devices, and that includes reasonable and necessary items and services used to diagnose and treat complications that arise from participation in one of these studies. In this webinar, we're going to cover the national coverage determination and help to understand how Medicare defines and covers routine costs during clinical trials. We're going to go over what kinds of services and things constitute routine costs. And we're going to also go through some examples of routine services so you can get a practical insight into the types of services and costs that are considered routine in clinical trial presentations. So before we start, I want to go through and give you some information about how these things are defined in the actual Code of Federal Regulations. So these definitions are part of the 42 CFR 405.201. And Jennifer just placed a link to that in the chat because I forgot to put that in the resources section of this webinar. But you can find all these definitions that we're going to cover right there in that CFR. Let's start with defining routine costs. So routine costs include all items and services that are otherwise generally available to Medicare beneficiaries. For example, if there exists a benefit category, and it's not statutorily excluded, and there is not a national coverage determination or decision on that, those are things that are provided in either the experimental or the control arm of the clinical trial. So all of those are included except the actual investigational item or service itself, unless it's otherwise covered outside the clinical trial. Items and services that are provided solely to satisfy data collection. And we're going to go through some examples of that coming up. So if they're for data collection and analysis that are needed and they're not used in the direct clinical management of the patient, then those things are not included in routine costs. And then finally, items and services that are customarily provided by the research sponsor free of charge for any enrollee in the clinical trial. Those are also not covered by Medicare as part of routine costs. So let's give an example. If you have to do a CT scan as part of a clinical trial to validate the placement of a device, that could be considered covered. However, doing a CT scan daily to monitor a patient, that's then considered data or data gathering and is not part of routine costs. So in general, the routine costs of a clinical trial include those costs that a Medicare beneficiary would normally be eligible for if there were no clinical trial. So this principle tries to ensure that Medicare beneficiaries aren't penalized nor have items or services taken away from them if they, were to participate in a qualifying clinical trial. So again, those routine costs include items or services that are typically provided absent a clinical trial. As we move on, let's talk about experimental device and the definitions that the 42 CFR has for that. So a category A, or experimental device, refers to a device for which absolute risk of the device has not been established. And that is, the initial questions of safety and effectiveness have not been resolved yet. And the FDA is unsure whether the device type can be safe and effective. Moving on, so non-experimental investigational devices. So a category B, or non-experimental investigational device, refers to a device for which the incremental risk is the primary risk in question. So that is, the initial questions of safety and effectiveness of the device, those have already been resolved. Or it is known that the device type can be safe and effective because, like for example, other manufacturers have already obtained FDA pre-market approval or clearance for that device type. So continuing on, qualifying clinical trial. So a qualifying clinical trial is a research study that tests new medical intervention safety and effectiveness in humans with the aim of improving health outcomes. As we move on, clinicaltrials.org. So clinicaltrials.org refers to the NIH's, or the National Institute of Health National Library of Medicine's online registry. So it's a whole big mouthful. And the results database of publicly and privately supported clinical studies of human participants conducted around the world. So in your slide deck and on the screen, you can see that this title is actually linked. So this is actually going to take you out to clinicaltrials.org, where you can find that information. And then investigational device exception, or the IDE. So the IDE refers to an FDA-approved IDE application that permits a device, which would otherwise be subject to marketing approval or clearance, to be shipped lawfully for the purpose of conducting a clinical study. And of course, that's all done in accordance with the Code of Federal Regulations that are listed on the slide. So this particular Code of Federal Regulations comes out of the 21 CFR Part 812. And then finally, let's define routine care items and services. So routine care items and services refer to items and services that, again, are otherwise generally available to Medicare beneficiaries. That is, there's a benefit category that exists. It's not statutorily excluded, and there's no national coverage or a national non-coverage decision. So routine care items and services are those that are furnished during a clinical trial, and that would be otherwise furnished even if the beneficiary were not enrolled in the clinical study. So I thought it was important to start with how these things are defined, to give you a little bit of background about the routine costs. And then we're going to start moving into some of the coverage related to IDE studies and some examples of how to make your life easier if you happen to be like a lead investigator for a study, and some of the things you need to do. So let's move on and talk about Medicare coverage relating to these IDE studies. All right. The Medicare Prescription Drug Improvement and Modernization Act of 2003, or MMA of 2003. This allowed Medicare payment of those routine costs of care furnished to Medicare beneficiaries in certain categories of investigational device exception studies. So covering the costs in these IDE studies, again, removes a financial barrier that could otherwise discourage Medicare beneficiaries from actually participating in one of these studies. And approval for a Category A, which is the experimental IDE study, that will allow coverage of routine care items and services furnished in the study, but not of a Category A device, which again is statutorily excluded from coverage. An approval of a Category B, or the non-experimental or investigational IDE study, this will allow for coverage of the Category B device and the routine items and services in the trial. So how do you request coverage for this? There's some regulations that you need to follow. So if you are a sponsor for a clinical trial, you have to get your FDA approval. So you have to have your FDA approval letter in hand. You have to submit a request packet to CMS. We're going to link out, and I am going to show you a little bit about submitting those requests. And again, if you're following along in the slide deck, these are actual links that will take you out to the sections of CMS's website that I'm talking about. Just give my computer a second to switch over. All right. So you can see on your screen is cms.gov, and I'm already into the part about Medicare coverage related to investigational device exception studies. You could also find this just by Googling, or not Googling, but searching IDE once you go into cms.gov. So again, since we used that link on the device or on our PowerPoint and went to this page directly, I just wanted to give you further information about how you could find it if you don't have the PowerPoint in front of you. All right, so once you have your FDA approval letter, you're going to need to submit a request packet to CMS. This article is going to walk you through the necessary components. And I'm going to scroll down to this section down here on requesting coverage. So this top part just said, you know, a little bit about the investigational device and about seeking your FDA approval. But we're going to scroll down here to requesting coverage. So first is the actual request letter that describes the scope and the nature of the IDE study. So I highly encourage you to use this checklist that is embedded here, and it's also linked on that slide. And I'm hoping, yep, right there. So in case you can't remember where to go, you have a couple different ways to get there. Use this crosswalk to help get you through what all you need to submit. So I'm going to bring that open. So when you open this checklist, you can see it walks you through what all is necessary. So this is going to help your sponsor ensure that they are submitting what CMS needs. So down here, items 1 through 10 that are listed on the bottom of this checklist, those are the items that are on the previous page. Whoops. Let's just go back this way. All right. Those are the items that are listed here. It's just all in one nice place to look. So you can use the crosswalk checklist here, make life really simple for yourself, you know, print this off and go through, or you can just read the long article. So as you go through here, I just want to point a few things out that it says that you need to have as part of your packet. So again, it's going to include your FDA letter, your request, your IDE study protocol. You're going to have to include your numbers. You're going to have to, for your device numbers, etc., and any supporting materials that you deem appropriate. And again, if you walk through these checklists, it really helps to ensure that you have all the things that are needed to make sure you are submitting to CMS to get that approval. All right, let's go back to this article. And I want to continue to scroll down in the article and give you some information about what else is actually contained in this article. So down here towards the bottom, there's information about how to submit this. So requests can be submitted either via email, and it gives you the email address. It can come hard copy. But if you are sending, electronically or email submission, you have additional things that you should go through and read about how those requests need to come in. So I do encourage you to go through and read all of this before you submit. And even if you are familiar with sending these requests already, it's always a good idea to go back and refresh yourself with what some of those requirements are to make sure there hasn't been any changes to that checklist, and to make sure you're submitting everything so you can get approval, hopefully on your first request. So a couple of things that you should note also. It does take about 30 days for each review through CMS. So you got to make sure you're allowing them some time to, get through on their end and completing their review for you before a decision is made. For approved studies, CMS will post information on its website each week for the study sponsor and providers and even the MACs. So make sure you're verifying approval on CMS's website before you start submitting those IDE-related claims. If you're a study sponsor, you should also notify CMS of any changes to your IDE studies that are going to require another FDA approval letter. So you can find direction about how to submit that and what you need all in this same article. Again, the remainder of this article just includes information about submitting to the MAC. And you can see here it says, down later to check with your MAC about additional, requirements. And we're going to talk about that as we move through the slide deck. All right, let's link back. And talk about some of those things that you should actually reach out to your MAC for when you start a clinical trial. So at this point, you've received your FDA letter. You've submitted your packet to CMS and you obtained approval. And now your next step to help ensure a smooth transition into billing should really be to contact us, your MAC, via this email address that's listed here, and keep us in the loop. When you email us, you should include information on who your lead investigator is and their contact information. You should also include the trial or IDE number and a request to be contacted by a CMD about your clinical trial. So why is it important to do this? There's several reasons listed here on how reaching out to your MAC would be beneficial in the process before billing to Medicare. So this includes really determining if there's any additional requirements that need to be met, discussing plans for claim submissions, having a discussion on any 99 codes that you're planning on billing. This is going to help us get ready for submissions and crosswalking, to an actual CPT code. This also gives time for you to discuss what you're going to be billing as routine services with our CMD. So these types of discussions can really help eliminate issues prior to billing. Now, I just want to note that in preparing this presentation, I went out to our website, so WPSGHA.com, and I was looking for information on this that would be helpful to guide you. And I found that we don't have a lot of clear direction, and that's why I wanted to include this in this PowerPoint presentation, because it's just one simple step that can help eliminate issues before they are issues. I am going to be working with our medical directors on actually formulating a article that will be on our website. It'll be on both Part A and Part B. And so you will have, direction on how to reach out. It will include the email address that's listed here and give some additional direction to help you to make sure you have a smooth transition with your billing, especially with those routine costs. So up to this point, you have an FDA approval, you have submitted to CMS, you have contacted your MAC about your plans to bill. So next, let's move on and talk about the National Coverage Determination. And that's NCD 310.1, Routine Costs and Clinical Trials. And we want to make sure that we're following the rules completely, so we know what we're doing when we're getting ready to bill. As with all NCDs and LCDs, we start off with indications and limitations of coverage. So effective for items and services that are furnished on or after July 9th of 2007, Medicare covers routine costs of qualifying clinical trials as reasonable and necessary items or services when they're used to diagnose and treat complications that arise from participation in a clinical trial. And of course, all other Medicare rules are going to apply in these cases as well. So as we discussed in the definitions, routine costs of clinical trials include all those items and services that are otherwise generally available to Medicare beneficiaries, and they're provided in either the experimental or the control arm of a clinical trial, with those exceptions that we talked about and that are listed again here. So again, remember, if it is the investigational item or service itself, the items and services solely to satisfy data collection, and items and services that are provided by the research sponsors free of charge to anyone that's enrolled. But there are some inclusions, so let's move on. Routine costs and clinical trials include, again, those items and services that are typically provided absent a clinical trial. Items, services that are required solely for the provision of the investigational item or service, the clinically appropriate monitoring of the effects of the item or service, or the prevention of complications. And it also includes items and services needed for reasonable and necessary care arising from the provision of an investigational item or service, in particular, for the diagnosis of treatment of complications. So all of this, again, is noted in the National Coverage Determination, the 310.1. All right. Non-covered items and services include items and services, again, for which Medicare payment is statutorily prohibited. So Medicare only covers the treatment of complications arising from the delivery of a non-covered item. So in other words, if there is a non-covered item that is included and a complication arises from that, then we will cover it. We won't cover the non-covered item, but we would cover the complication. So however, if an item or service is not covered by virtue of a national coverage policy, like in 100-3, which is your National Coverage Determination Manual, and the focus of a qualifying clinical trial, the routine cost of the clinical trial will be covered by Medicare, but again, not the non-covered item or service itself. So as we move on, and I know a lot of this seems very duplicative, but I'm trying to really drive home the fact of what is covered and what is not recovered and what these requirements actually say. So let's move on and talk about some of the requirements again for, as outlined in the NCD. So any clinical trial receiving Medicare coverage of routine costs must meet these following 3 requirements that are listed here on the slide. So the subject or purpose of the trial must be for the evaluation of an item or service that falls within the Medicare benefit category, and it's not statutorily excluded from coverage. The trial must not be designed exclusively to test toxicity or disease pathophysiology. So it must be therapeutic, the intent of it. And trials of therapeutic interventions must enroll participants with diagnosed disease rather than healthy volunteers. So trials of diagnostic interventions may enroll healthy patients in order to have a proper control group. So again, that trials of therapeutic interventions must enroll patients with diagnosed disease. Trials of diagnostic interventions, those may enroll healthy beneficiaries. So although these are things that you must prove to get approval, it's still important to remember that when you're going to bill your IDE, you remember these things because you want to ensure that you are following all the guidelines and you have all the information in your documentation. So the 3 requirements that we just talked about on the last slide are insufficient by themselves to qualify a clinical trial for Medicare coverage of routine costs. Clinical trials also have to have these following characteristics that we're going to discuss on the next couple of slides. However, some trials, as described on these next couple of slides, are presumed to meet some characteristics, and they may automatically be qualified for Medicare coverage. So we'll go over that automatic qualification too. So the principal purpose of the trial is to test whether the intervention potentially improves the participant's health outcome. The trial is well supported by available scientific and medical information, or it is intended to clarify or establish the health outcomes of interventions already in common clinical use. Another characteristic, the trial does not unjustifiably duplicate or other existing studies. The trial design, I should say, is appropriate to answer the research questions being asked in the trial. Additional characteristics is the trial is sponsored by a credible organization or an individual that's capable of executing the purpose of the trial successfully. Next, the trial is in compliance with federal regulations relating to the protection of human subjects. And finally, all aspects of the trial are conducted according to the appropriate standards of scientific integrity. So using the authority found in the Social Security Act, the Agency of Health Research and Quality, or the acronym for that is AHRQ, they will convene a multi-agency federal panel, which they'll call the panel, which is composed of representatives of the Department of Health and Human Services, their research agency. It includes the National Institute of Health, the Center for Disease Control and Prevention, the Food and Drug Administration, Offices of Human Research and Protection, and research arms of the Department of Defense and the Department of Veterans Affairs. and they utilize them to develop the qualifying criteria that will indicate a strong probability that a trial exhibits these 7 desirable characteristics that we just went through on the last several slides. So these characteristics will be easily verifiable and where possible, exist together. I just lost my words, sorry. So anyway, trials that meet these qualifying criteria, they're going to receive Medicare coverage of their associated routine costs. This panel is not reviewing or approving the individual trials. This multi-agency panel, they actually will meet periodically to review and evaluate the program, recommend any necessary refinements to the Centers for Medicare and Medicaid Services. Let's move on and talk about what makes some trials automatically qualified to receive Medicare coverage. Some clinical trials, again, are automatically qualified to receive Medicare coverage of their routine costs because they've been deemed by the Agency for Health Research and Quality, that's that AHRQ that I talked about, in conjunction with other agencies represented by that multi-agency panel, to be highly likely to have those above listed 7 desirable characteristics of a clinical trial. The principal investigators of these automatically qualified trials, you do not need to certify that the trial meets the qualifying criteria, but you still must enroll the trial in the Medicare Clinical Trials Registry for administrative purposes. So trials deemed automatically qualified are usually trials that are funded by the NIH, the CDC, the AHRQ, CMS, Department of Defense, and Veterans Administration, like we talked about. Trials supported by centers or cooperative groups that are funded by these other agencies that we talked about. Trials conducted under an investigational new drug application reviewed by the FDA. And finally, drug trials that are exempt from having an IND under that 21 CFR, which is 21 CFR 310 or 312.2B1. I'm going to just place that in the chat real quick. They're going to be deemed automatically qualified until the qualifying criteria are developed and the certification process is in place. So at that time, then the principal investigators of these trials must certify that the trials meet the qualifying criteria in order to maintain that Medicare coverage of the routine costs. So this certification process will only affect the future status of the trial, and it's not going to be used to retroactively change the earlier deemed status. The CMS, through the NCD process, through an individualized assessment of benefits and risks and research potential, may determine that certain items or services for which there is some evidence of significant medical benefit, but for which there is insufficient evidence to maybe fully support reasonable and necessary determination, are only reasonable and necessary when provided in a clinical trial. So that means the requirements defined in the NCD. All right. So again, Medicare will cover those routine costs of the qualifying clinical trials that have been deemed to be automatically qualified, have certified that they meet the quality criteria or are required through the NCD process unless CMS's chief clinical officers subsequently find that the clinical trial doesn't meet the qualifying criteria or that it may jeopardize the safety or welfare of the Medicare beneficiaries. Hopefully this never happens, but should CMS find that the trial's principal investigator misrepresented that the trial met the necessary qualifying criteria in order to gain Medicare coverage of routine costs, then Medicare coverage of those routine costs is going to be denied. In the case of such a denial, the Medicare beneficiary that's enrolled in the trial is not going to be held liable for those costs that, are consistent with the provision of the Social Security Act. Where appropriate, the billing providers are going to be held liable for those costs, and fraud investigations of those billing providers and the trial's principal investigators may be pursued. So please don't misrepresent, any information on your qualifying criteria. And I apologize, my computer is real slow. So if there seems like very deliberate pauses, it's because I'm just waiting for my computer to catch up with me. So let's continue and move on through the process. So now we've received CMS approval, we've reached out to our MAC, we reviewed the coverage criteria to make sure we're following all the criteria of the NCD, and now we're ready to bill. So let's start by talking about what not to bill in a clinical trial. All right, as a provider of clinical trial, again, let's talk about these things that should not be billed. First is the investigational item or service itself. This would be unless this item or service is available to all Medicare beneficiaries absent the clinical trial. Remember, if you're already getting remuneration for something that is part of the clinical trial, you should not bill to Medicare because that is actually part of the trial. Also, if the sponsor is paying the ID device and there is no cost incurred for the device, then you can only bill for the administration of the procedure, or administration, I should say, or procedure if they're medically reasonable and necessary. Item services that are provided solely for data collection are important to keep in mind of what not to bill. So those non-routine costs, that is something you need to separate out from the costs constituting, your standard of care. So for example, if your patient's in a clinical trial and they're having laboratory and radiological studies which exceed the requirements of the ordinary clinical care of a patient, because the requirements for the study's data collection are higher than what is required for clinical care of the patient. And this could be something like monthly or weekly CT scans for conditions where generally only a CT scan would be necessary. So these would be considered in excess of what is required out of normal ordinary care, and they're considered non-routine or data collection purposes, and they're not covered. So think about these things in your documentation as well. This is going to help in determining if you can or cannot include it on your claim. So document which items and services are required as part of ordinary clinical care for the beneficiary, which are required in addition to meet the data collection requirements of the study. And then you should bill these respectively as covered or non-covered, whichever applies. So remember, Medicare's potential willingness to pay for an item or service does not determine whether that item or service is covered. Medicare must be on a level playing field with all payers types regarding bills for routine costs in clinical trials. So finally, if other items and services not covered as part of your routine costs include otherwise non-covered items and services, that includes items and services for which payment is statutorily prohibited unless it's required for treatment, you would not bill those to us. So guidance from the contractor may be required to determine if such treatment of these complications are covered. And that's why back several slides ago, I said it's of utmost importance that you reach out to your MAC, that you have those conversations, and that you can touch base with a medical director on what types of items or services you anticipate billing as part of your routine costs. All right, so what's included on claims? If you are Part B biller or billing Part B services, providers should enter the clinical trial number and the non-clinical trial services on separate lines when both types of services are submitted on the same claim form. As we just spoke about, items and services that are provided free of charge by your research sponsors should not be billed to Medicare. These items are required, if those items are required for Medicare payment or other payable services, providers should submit those items as non-covered, and then you would include the appropriate modifiers on those. And that's generally the modifiers FB, GX, and GY. So be sure when billing, you include any appropriate modifiers on your claims when necessary. Also, other appropriate clinical trial modifiers would be the modifier Q0. So that is the investigational clinical service provided in a clinical research study that is an approved clinical research study. So the investigational clinical services are defined as those items and services that are being investigated as an objective within the study. Investigational clinical services may include items or services that are approved, unapproved, or otherwise covered or even not covered under Medicare. And then there's the modifier QM, and that's the routine clinical services approved in a clinical research study that is an approved clinical research study. Just a reminder, routine clinical services, again, are defined as those items or services that are covered for Medicare beneficiaries outside the clinical research study. They are used for direct patient care management within the study, and they do not meet the definition of an investigational clinical service. So another item that must be included on the claim includes your reporting of the IDE or clinical trial number. And the placement of that actually depends on the type of bill that you are submitting. So on the UB04, which is for facility billing, on the UB04, this information is generally put in the comments field. However, on the 1500 for the Part B billing, on the 1500, this information will generally be in field 19, and it's usually preceded by the alpha character CT. So claims must also include appropriate ICD-10 diagnoses codes for the clinical trial. The ICD-10 code Z00.6 and either the primary or the secondary position is also necessary. Finally, for Part A, the appropriate device HCPCS code is required, and if applicable, must also be reported on the claim. All right, So for additional billing information, you're really encouraged to use the link provided on this slide and go to the Medicare Claims Processing Manual, which is Chapter 32, Section 68 for the IDE studies. So Section 69 is for qualifying clinical trials. All right. So that was a lot of information. Let's just recap. What did we learn today? There was a lot. We gained an understanding of what constitutes routine costs of clinical trials and investigational devices. And to achieve this, we went through and we reviewed the NCD 310.1. We went over some coverage criteria. We talked about those routine costs, examples of routine services, and we even kind of went through the chronological order of what you need to do. I do see Michelle also placed some additional information in the chat that is useful for you in billing on the electronic claim of the 837P. And in that, she gave the loop numbers, etc. So please jot that information down. All right, at this time, I am going to look over at the chat and see if any questions have come in. And I'm not seeing anything in the chat. So in the interest of time, I'm going to keep moving on. But if you have something, I will stop right before we end and go over those questions. All right. After this webinar is complete, those of you who logged into the webinar, you're going to receive an email. You're not going to receive that email if you only called in via the phone or if you logged in via a mobile device like your phone. This email is also going to be your proof of attendance and has contact hours on it if you need it. So don't delete it without reading it. If you don't get that certificate of achievement or proof of attendance, go ahead and email us at that email address that is listed all over throughout this presentation, which is wps.gha.education@wpsic.com. And just say that, you know, you logged on via a mobile device or you listen via phone, give us a phone number and I'll go ahead and send out a certificate of achievement to you. If you have any follow-up questions, so in the next several days, in the next 7 days to be exact, if you think of any questions regarding this event, just email us those questions at that same email address, and it's also listed here on your slide deck. So you can link right to an email. By using that, it'll populate in the subject matter as well. Just put in the subject line, if it doesn't automatically populate, routine costs of clinical trials, and ask your question, and we'll go ahead and get that answered and send that back out to you. Remember, don't send us any claim-specific questions. Unfortunately, if you're having an issue with a claim processing or you have claim processing questions, those have to go back to customer service because in provider outreach, we don't have the access to those systems to look that information up. So if it's something regarding the coverage criteria, et cetera, go ahead and send those questions to us within the next 7 business days. As I stated at the start of this presentation, we value your opinion. We want to hear from you on how we did on this event. So Jennifer placed a copy of the survey link into the chat again for you. I do encourage you to take this survey now. It only takes a few minutes to complete, and that's why we want to give you the opportunity to do it now while we're still in session. Give you a few minutes to do that out of the allocated time you took for this event. The nice part is, again, about our surveys is it gives you the opportunity to tell us what else you need in the future, what kind of additional education, whether it be type of bill specific, whether it be topic specific, that you think would be valuable. We do a lot of our education based off those survey requests. Which brings us to, we want to hear from you. We're committed to making these changes and improving your educational experience. So just based off of some recent survey comments, we've done a few things to help our providers. We have now included chapters into our YouTube. So if you go to listen to this as an encore event on our YouTube page, in the description of the YouTube, you'll see there are time slots for different sections, which we call chapters. So you can skip to and re-listen to just the section you're interested in. We've also included training indicators in our live event descriptions. So you know if the event is regarding billing, if the event is clinical in nature, if the event happens to be specific to like the FIS system or the MCE system, or even a specific provider type. So we've included those types of things as well. So seeing no more questions, on behalf of Jennifer and myself, as well as policy and medical review, we want to thank you for your participation in today's event. So this concludes our webinar, and you may now disconnect.